For LBC, I'm Charlotte Morgan.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, very good evening. It's 8:01 on LBC. Welcome to Wednesday's Cross Question. With me in the studio, to my right, Caroline Pidgeon, leader of the Liberal Democrats on the London Assembly. We have Keith Prince, Conservative member of the London Assembly. That's 4 London Assembly members in 2 days on Cross Question. People are going to think that we should be having people from Manchester.
You wait all year for one, then 4 come along all at once.
Exactly. Suzanne Evans, good friend of the programme, political commentator, formerly Deputy Chairman of UKIP, and Lewis Goodall, co-presenter of the Newsagents podcast, and of course you can listen to him in this time slot every Friday on LBC. Welcome to you all. You can watch us on Global Player. If you'd like to put a question to the panel, the lines are open 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850, or you can tell Alexa to send a comment to LBC and submit your question that way.
0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's go to our first question. It's the kind of question I absolutely love. James is in Ayrshire. Hello, James.
Hello, Ian. It's really nice to speak to you again, and Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you.
Happy to you. My question is this. What is the highest formal qualification that your panel hold in mathematics? And do they feel that, depending on their answer, their lack of expertise in mathematics is in some way impinged on their future careers?
Interesting.
Caroline Pidgeon.
I actually have an A-level in pure mathematics.
Do you?
And I did it in my first year of university as well. But I have to say it's probably had little help with my career. And I would say that when you get to A-level and beyond, hardly any numbers feature. It's all algebra and letters. So really of little use to everyday life. But it is important that we do make sure young people are able to do maths properly, and actually investing and catching up all those children who lost out in the lockdown is really important.
What about the idea that Rishi Sunak's come up with today to make everybody do maths up to the age of 18?
I don't think it's for everyone. I think actually the investment needs to go in early years to really help young children with numeracy and literacy. And I think at the moment you need to be putting money into primary school to help children. I have a 9-year-old. I have seen the gap they have had through the lockdowns. They've missed out in the pandemic. And that's with us trying to teach him.
Well, luckily, Mummy's there to teach them.
Luckily, I'm there to teach him algebra, exactly. And he does now know his times.
But can you remember it all? Because I have to say, if you put a maths O-level paper, because of course I'm old enough to do O-levels, in front of me now, I doubt I'd get 5%.
Oh, no, absolutely. You don't remember it. You learn for the exam. So I think practical maths is really important in everyday life, but actually let's support the early years and make sure children get the basics right early on.
Keith Prince.
Well, I've got 2 equivalent levels. I've got an O-level and a CSE grade 1.
That's the same thing.
Exactly, yeah. That's as high as I went. I went and did A-level economics. But
yeah, I did that, and it's very mathematical, isn't it? Which I didn't realise before I started.
Yeah, I enjoyed economics.
I didn't.
What can I say?
Suzanne.
Well, I'm on a par with Keith, actually. I've got a CSE grade 1, but I also did do the O-level and got a paltry B. But did I like maths? No. Was I very good at it? No. Have I ever needed it in my future career? No. I think it's been a complete waste of time. And I honestly think I learnt far more about arithmetic actually working on a market stall as my Saturday job, where we didn't have calculators, we didn't have tills, we had to do everything in our head. So I think my mental arithmetic is pretty good. But algebra, calculus, logarithms, what is the point? Really, what is the point? I mean, Pythagoras' theorem, it might come up in a quiz show in a pub one day, but otherwise I don't think I learned a thing, really. I don't think it's any use at all.
Now, Lewis, I know, because I've interviewed you for my All Talk podcast, that you did not do mathematics at university.
Did that come up? At university, right, I see. I thought you meant my earlier qualifications.
No.
Right, yeah.
So what is your mathematical
qualification? I didn't do CSE. CSE, what on earth is that? I did GCSE.
You're too young, darling. You're far too young.
That was my very skillful way of pointing out how much younger I am. No, I did GCSE maths. Although when I went to university, because I did sort of papers in political economy, they gave us some catch-up maths lessons for those of us who hadn't done A-level maths, which actually was really, really useful. And I sort of I do think actually there are very few journalists who really know any maths or stats in particular, and actually
or can count.
And actually, so it has actually, even being vaguely numerate has occasionally been quite helpful in journalism, just because actually, not speaking ill of the rest of my profession, quite a few aren't, and it sometimes becomes particularly clear, particularly in the use of sort of government statistics and all those sort of things.
I mean, let's look at the politics of this, because this was, it seems to me, the only meaningful announcement in Rishi Sunak's speech today. And you think, well, if you're going to make a big New Year's speech, make it a big New Year's speech, and announcing that you want to concentrate on improving maths, I wouldn't say was the biggest thing. When people are talking about strikes, when they're talking about the problems in the NHS, the cost of living crisis, it was a bit tone deaf, wasn't it, Keith?
Yeah. Well, I've got to agree with you, Ian. I mean, it's a bit late. If you do maths at 18, it's a bit late. As Caroline quite rightly said, early years are so important for all this stuff, and that's really where children absorb information much better in their early years. So I think that's where we should be concentrating the budgets. That's where the real work has to be done.
Suzanne?
Yeah, I thought the speech was really dull all round. I think you articulated very well the problems in it earlier in the programme, actually, Ian, so I won't go over that again. But I think if you want to talk about education and you want to do something different, don't try and rehash something that Michael Gove tried to do back in 2014, I think, when he said that if you didn't pass your GCSE maths, you'd have to keep going until you did, and if you did pass it, you'd have to do it for A-level. This is much the same thing, I think, but I'd like to see looking at practical subjects. So never mind maths, but what about budgeting? What about how to manage your debt? What about taxation? What about how to get a mortgage and what the implications are on interest rates? I think those would be of far more practical use to students than just pure maths.
It's A-level economics, isn't it, Ian? The one you didn't get on with too well.
Yeah, I got grade E.
Oh my gosh.
But it was the first year that my school had ever done A-level economics, so I was just grateful to have passed, frankly, and I got grade C at O-level. Although I think that was GCSE even in those days. But I was actually put down a stream in maths because I was so bad at it.
Well, it hasn't held you back.
No, it hasn't. I wouldn't be where I am today without grade C maths, I don't think. Right, let's take thank you very much for that, James. Let's take an allied question on Rishi Sunak's speech from Pam in Brent. Pam, hello, go ahead.
Hello, good evening, Ian. Good evening, panel. The thing I mostly noticed with Rishi Sunak's speech was that he spent approximately 2 seconds on anything to do with climate change. I've also noticed in the rest of the day that almost nobody has picked up on that, no commentator and no member of the public, and I was wondering why the panel thought that was.
Interesting. We have had a couple of texts and tweets pointing that out. Maybe one of them was from you. I don't know, Pam. Caroline Pidgeon, actually, it's the second time I started with you, but I'm going to do it anyway. Obviously, it's a subject close to most Lib Dem hearts, this. But when you're making a speech like this, you can't cover everything, can you?
You can't, but you need to have some substance there. And actually, I think it was a mistake, him going out today with his speech leading, as we heard yesterday, that he was going to be proposing maths to 18, when actually he should have been really talking about the issues that people are talking about, Londoners are talking about, people across the country are talking about, the strikes that are affecting our everyday lives, the crisis in the NHS. That should have been the heart of it, showing leadership. What's he going to do about these issues? And actually the climate emergency, as your callers mentioned, is part of that, and perhaps could have been part of that, showing leadership, showing what he is going to do to try to tackle the issues of the day, rather than some theoretical thing in a couple of years' time. So I think very weak, and I think what's been noticeable over the Christmas-New Year period, the absence of leadership, the absence of this government, and I think it's going to be a very tough year indeed.
Lewis Goodall, the climate emergency is something that the government protested it is dealing with, and that they've got lots of green policies, but they do come under a lot of criticism for not really either doing more or talking about it more.
Yeah, I think one of the ironies about this is that many Liberals probably assumed that in many ways when Sunak took over from Johnson, that Sunak represents a sort of more liberal tint in conservatism. I mean, ironically, in all sorts of ways, you can make an argument to say Johnson is far more actually offered, at least certainly if you take green issues and climate change, for example, Johnson was more impassioned. You can make an argument about how committed he was to it, but he was definitely more impassioned about it than I think Sunak.
Well, he's getting it in one ear from Kerry and the other ear from Stanley.
Yeah, well, exactly. I think he genuinely believed it in a way I think Sunak is a little bit more sceptical. I think more generally on the speech, look, I think if you're being generous to Sunak, I think what you can say is that he has, since he became Prime Minister, he saw his first job as trying to stabilise things, which politically he has done. And secondly, he is trying to craft a narrative, which is to say this is a government which is doing and not just talking all of the time. He thinks if he can try and create an air of kind of quiet competence, that will translate into some electoral recovery. I think the problem, though, if you look at what he actually offered and what he was promising, he made great play about these 5 things against which he should be judged. Well, if you take each of them in turn, one is around halving inflation. Well, the OBR says that inflation is going to halve, come what may anyway, and that makes sense because you've already had the energy shock. So as long as that doesn't happen again, then inflation will by definition come down. Get the economy growing. Well, he didn't actually give a date about when that was going to be. Presumably that will be at some point before the next general election. Well, that's in 2024, long way away. Debt falling, ditto. Waiting list coming down. Well, they're so high as it is, it would be extraordinary if they were to go up even more. And small boats, this year around small boats, if you actually listen to what he said we will pass laws to deal with it rather than stop it. So, actually he was doing a whole thing about saying, well, I'm not going to be one of those politicians who comes along and promises the earth. I think actually he wasn't promising very much at all if you look at the detail of each of the pledges. Maybe
that's a good thing, Keith Prince, in that maybe politicians, it's better to under-promise than over-promise.
Well, I always say that. I always say...
and you get re-elected.
I do believe in that. I think the problem that Richie has really is that clearly, there are those who accept there is a climate crisis. The party has got green credentials.
Do you not accept that?
I think there's still more work to be done on that, to be honest.
How much more when you've got 99% of the world's scientists agreeing that there is a crisis?
You haven't actually.
You have.
But you just haven't. And I'll give you the evidence offline, Ian, on that. But
please don't.
The bottom line is that he's in a difficult position because, yes, the green agenda is important, but there are more pressing issues. And I feel the thing that I feel is disappointing that he didn't talk a bit more about the cost of living crisis and the fuel crisis, and that's what I'd like to have seen him to address. I think he played fairly safe. I mean, allegedly he's a safe pair of hands, so I can see why he played safe. But I'd like to have seen him be a bit more aggressive on the cost of living and fuel crisis. But I don't think, to be honest with you, if you're struggling to put food on the table, if you're struggling to pay to keep yourself warm, the green agenda isn't top of your list.
You say allegedly he's a safe pair of hands. I mean, from your answers so far, it doesn't sound to me as if you're a great fan of your leader.
I always support the leader, Ian, always.
Did you support Liz Truss?
I'd voted for her, actually.
Says a lot. Suzanne Evans.
I'm not in the slightest bit surprised he didn't mention climate change in his speech. So what are the 3 issues that are always top in every voter's mind? Or not every voter's...
Education.
Well, or the economy, the NHS and immigration. Those are also the top 3. And so he did address those in this. But, the Tories are languishing in the polls on barely scraping between 20 and 30%. He's got 18 months to turn this around. He's got to focus on those top 3. He's got to focus on the things that matter. And with the best will in the world, even those of us who do appreciate the issues around climate change and feel passionately about it, when you come to a cost of living crisis and you can't afford an expensive electric car and the price of renewable energy is just knocked into a cocked hat, frankly, by the whole energy catastrophe that we're facing, that goes way, way down to the bottom of the agenda.
Right, we'll take more of your calls in a moment. 0345 6060 973. Kenny says, Rishi spends 2 seconds on climate change, but he spent less than that on Brexit. Why is that? The address you need is james.o'brien@lbc.co.uk. It's 8:15.
LBC Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
17 minutes past 8, we have the leader of the Liberal Democrats on the London Assembly, Caroline Pidgeon, with us, Suzanne Evans, former Deputy Chairman of UKIP, Lewis Goodall, co-host of the Newsagents podcast, and Keith Prince, Conservative member of the London Assembly. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. Let's go to our next caller. It's June in Barnsley. Hi, June. Oh, it's a text. Just what I need when I don't want to cough, but I'm going to. Excuse me. Is Nadine Dorries right that this government has no mandate to rip up Boris Johnson's policies? Suzanne Evans.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? How many party political manifestos have we all seen? And then the party that's written it gets into government and it doesn't usually happen, or it gets kicked into the long grass. Arguably, no, I think June is absolutely right. Boris Johnson's policies are the ones that people voted for. But unfortunately, Boris Johnson is gone. His own MPs wanted to get rid of him. So here we are with a whole new set of policies, and they're not ones that I particularly like. But it's what we've got, unfortunately. But
she's ripping up the British Constitution, isn't she, by saying that? Because there's nothing to say that a Prime Minister can't be replaced.
No, there isn't. Absolutely right. And that's why I say it's just, in a sense, it's tough luck, it's politics, it's what happens. And unfortunately, us voters just have to suck it up.
Keith Prince, I imagine you rather agree with Nadine.
Well, yeah, I do think that if you make a manifesto pledge, you should stick to it. But of course, those manifesto pledges were made by Boris Johnson, and he isn't the Prime Minister anymore. So it's a difficult one, but because many people will say, well, we voted for Boris Johnson for PM, and what right's the party got to elect someone else as PM? But of course, you don't actually elect the PM, you just vote for your local MP, and if enough of those are of one party, that party wins the election.
But Boris Johnson was reneging on his own manifesto pledges. It was the Boris Johnson government that was increasing national insurance. They said they weren't going to do that. OK, perhaps it was partly at Sunak's behest, but it's not. I mean, Johnson was himself reneging on all sorts of elements, and they cited at the time, well, lots of change because of the pandemic and so on. Yeah, sure thing. But in that sense, this was a process which had already begun. And you've got to remember as well. I mean, there is a lot of continuity between the Johnson and Sunak governments. I mean, yeah, there's a very big difference in terms of style and in terms of their instincts and so on. But to some extent, all of the problems that Sunak is grappling with are, to a greater or lesser extent, ones that the Johnson government was grappling with. And the fact that Sunak, as we saw today, was having to try and essentially represent change. He said, I am the change that people want to see. But ultimately, he's not only succeeding Boris Johnson, but he's succeeded Liz Truss, but also Theresa May and David Cameron. It's very, very hard. The Conservatives have been very good at self-renewing in office over the last 12 to 13 years. It's a very, very, very difficult trick to pull it off again.
Caroline?
Yeah, I mean, I think this government has no mandate at all, and I think.
But it does. It has. It won an election.
Well, yes,
the Conservative Party won the election.
They did win an election, and they have changed the leader. And when you talk to people around the world, they look at you and say, "You've just had an election." I say, "No, we've got a new leader, we've got a new Prime Minister, but we haven't actually had an election. We haven't actually had a say." And I think there is a growing appetite.
That does happen in other countries, you know.
Yeah, I think there is a growing appetite out there, and it feels to me, when you talk to voters on the doorstep, you're out chatting to community groups, there is that feeling a bit like the build up to 1997, that people are fed up of this lot. They feel like that the Conservatives feel they've got an entitlement to rule, they can do what they like in office, they've broken rules, they have behaved appallingly, and the economic crisis that we're in following the mini budget of Liz Truss, my goodness. We are suffering as a result of that, and I think people won't forgive them. And when people have got relatives being treated in the NHS, standing, queuing in corridors, being treated in corridors, people dying because the ambulances can't get to them because there aren't ambulances. All of this horror that we're experiencing at the moment, that human cost, that starts to sink in. And I really think that there's that growing momentum as we get near a general election. I think there will be that movement for change. And I hope we start to see across the country people thinking carefully which party can get the Conservatives out.
Why is it, though, that your party is making absolutely no impact in the opinion polls?
Well, we are in our target seats, doing very well. We have won 3 by-elections with huge swings in recent years. We don't get the airtime, as you know. I'm delighted to be here this evening chatting on behalf of my party. But it is challenging.
That's pretty lame excuse, to be fair.
No, it's not. We don't get the same airtime. But yeah, we need to be doing better and getting our message out. Labour Party's got to improve as well if they're to show that they're credible.
But why is everything going to the Labour Party? All of the ex-Tory votes don't seem to be going to you. You've been on 8, 9, 10% all the way through this Parliament. You would expect now for you to be picking up votes to, I mean, OK, even if you don't get to the giddy heights of sort of 20, 22%, which you have done in the past, you would expect you to be sort of 12 to 15% at least, and you're not.
Yeah.
And you can't explain that by lack of airtime.
No, I can't explain that. But what I would say is in the seats where we are fighting Conservatives very hard, we are doing well. And if you go into those seats, you'll start to see Lib Dems gaining. And you've seen the 3 by-elections we've had, parliamentary by-elections, where we have won seats with huge swings from the Conservatives. There is that feeling on the ground of non-Conservative voters saying, I've had enough. I have to use this voting system to vote
that will
for
happen
the
in
party.
by-elections because all of the efforts are concentrated in one place.
But I think you will also start to see that, and that trading of votes of different parts of the country, people saying, actually, I'm here, I don't want the Conservatives. Labour are the best people in this seat, but that place, actually, there's a Lib Dem, and people trade votes, and that's what happened successfully in 97.
Suzanne Evans, the Reform Party, led by Richard Tice, with presumably Nigel Farage pulling the strings in the background, your old friend.
My old friend.
In inverted commas. They've announced today they are going to stand against every Conservative. Yeah. They say that's a guarantee. Now, that could be electorally significant, couldn't it?
Yes, it absolutely could. I mean, as I said earlier, the Tories are doing very badly in the polls anyway, although, as I always say, Ian, there's only one poll that matters, and that's the one actually on the election day when people tick the box on their ballot paper. It was interesting because I watched Richard Tice's speech today, or most of it anyway, and I thought his policies are great. I agree with most of what he said, but I'm not really sure he's got the va-va-voom or the charisma to actually be able to take Reform Party forward. When Nigel Farage was the leader of UKIP and snapping at the Conservatives' heels, he had a huge following. Like him or loathe him, and most people fall into one or other of those camps, he was a man who could affect change. And of course, he also had Brexit. He also had this absolute commitment to Brexit that swept up half the country. Richard Tice is in a very different situation. I do find it interesting that smaller parties are not picking up more votes, including the Lib Dems and Reform. I think by-elections are a very, very different issue. I will say on this programme, I voted Lib Dem in one of those by-elections. I voted Lib Dem in North Shropshire, where I now live.
Down with a feather.
I know, surprised me as well. But I felt, that the Conservatives...
There must have been about a dozen candidates to choose from.
There were, but I voted for Helen Morgan.
There was a Reform candidate as well.
There was a Reform candidate, but I voted for Helen Morgan.
All these UKIP people are always a bit suspicious of you. They were right, weren't they?
No, absolutely not. But, whether I'll do the same in the general election or not, I'll be honest, I don't know. I mean, part of my logic for voting for Helen was because the Lib Dems were one of the few people that were standing against ongoing lockdown policies, and I felt very strongly that we'd had enough of that, and that was why. But yeah, the Tories have got a hell of a lot to. I totally agree with Caroline. It does feel like 1997. It does feel like the Tories have become complacent. It does feel like they have an entitlement that they need a bit of a kicking to actually perhaps come back stronger next time.
I'm tempted to ask you, Lewis, if it feels like 1997, but you would have been, 4 years older?
I was the grand old age of 8, as a matter of fact. I do remember it. It was my first election that I remember, as a matter of fact. Although, actually, not the first political event I remember, that was the 1996 budget.
Oh, my goodness.
No, but I remember that just because it happened to be on CITV and it replaced CITV that day. But that piqued my interest. And here we are now.
Are we returning to two-party politics, do you think, now? Or, I won't say permanently, but it does seem to be that smaller parties, partly because of, I'll say before Caroline does, our electoral system, are finding it much more difficult to break through now.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, obviously, in the post-Brexit period, we did see this strange restoration of two-party politics in particular. That said, I think that what Caroline said is right, is that we have seen, we've got ample electoral evidence for this now, both in local elections and by-elections, highly efficient redistribution of non-Conservative votes to wherever the non-Conservative candidate is best placed. And although, Suzanne's absolutely right, by-elections are one thing, as I say, that is supported by 2 rounds of local elections. Now we've even seen it in Scotland and Wales as well. And although the kind of clarion call of tactical voting is always something, I mean, everyone always talks about it every election, never seems to quite ever materialise. Every now and again it does, and 1997 was an example of that, and it is entirely plausible and credible that we are heading for a similar sort of moment. So even though there may not be great love for smaller parties, it might be that they end up scoring reasonably well, partly as a result of simply not being the Conservative candidate in any given place.
Let's bring John in Bristol into the conversation. John, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello.
Hi.
Yes, hi. Yes, given that the Conservatives have done such a great job in governing the country in the last 13 years, what more do they need to do to win the next general election?
Are you being sarcastic?
I don't know, Ian. I mean...
Do you think they've done a good job in the last 13 years, John? We weren't sure whether you were meaning that accurately or whether you were being sarcastic.
No, my question is to you.
Yeah.
Okay.
He asked the questions, not you.
That's true.
Go on then, Suzanne.
What do they need to do? Well, I think first and foremost, they actually need to stop the boats coming. I'm not sure if they're going to do that.
Does that really
I think
affect
it is a
people's votes massively?
I think it does. I think it's a massive issue. Immigration is always a massive issue, and it's
I can see
so
that it might
out
be in
of control
Dover
now. Nearly 46,000 people coming over in boats. We don't know who they are. We don't know whether they've got criminal records. We don't know whether they have any legal claim to asylum. We often don't know where they're even from. I think that's a big issue. I think if the Tories don't want to win the election, I think they should just keep on doing the same thing that they've already been doing, talking about stopping the votes but not actually doing it, raising taxes, demoralising business, failing to challenge wokery in the civil service and the public sector.
So the question is, what do we need to do to win the next election? Well, I think in some respects Richie is doing that. Richie is steadying the ship. But I think what we have to do is we have to regain people's trust, actually. I think we have to prove that we can be trusted to deal with the economy, with the issues that are troubling people at the moment, sort out the NHS. But more important than all that, we need to keep our promises. We need to do what we say we're going to do.
The problem is that's not been done in the last 12 years. There's been endless promises and they've not been delivered.
Well, we've delivered on a lot of stuff over the last 12 years, actually. We've delivered on Brexit.
Sort of. We've still got the issue of Northern Ireland. Brexit has not been taken advantage of. We've got Brexit, but we're not really using it to our advantage.
Caroline?
There's talk now
because there isn't much advantage, quite frankly, about Brexit.
Disagree on that.
But, I'm sure we will. But I think that there's a real challenge that everyone is feeling it in their pockets, unless they can start to feel that actually, they've got more money in their pocket, they've got more money to spend on their family, that they feel their quality of life is better, which is not going to happen within that period of time. So I think that they, are in a very difficult position. The other parties have got to show, including mine, what our record is and what we're going to be putting forward. And I don't think, the issue about, sorting out those coming over by boats, I actually think we need to move to a really much more mature conversation about some of these very serious issues. These are people fleeing persecution from all around the world who have suffered things that we cannot imagine. And 98% of those who arrive in small boats claim asylum, and only a very small number are refused because they're genuine asylum seekers, and they're coming from places like Afghanistan, they're Kurds, they're people coming from Syria. We need to actually modernise our refugee and asylum system. A quarter
of them are coming from Albania.
And we need to, there is an issue around Albania, which, we need to tackle those gangs and so on. But actually, we've always been a compassionate country. We've always welcomed refugees and asylum seekers. Our wealth and Great Britain has been built on that. And I really
take
wish
far fewer
we
per
could
head
change
than
that.
Comparable European countries.
Yeah, I think we really need to change the narrative on things like that. And as I've sort of listened to different programmes over the Christmas and New Year period, actually people want compassion. They want people to be genuinely human and treat people as human beings. And I really hope that we start to see that sort of message coming from this government, rather than playing to that sort of worry and concern and sort of extremist ideology.
Also, to link it back to that first question we had about climate change. I mean, if we think we've got a refugee problem now, I mean, you want to see where we're going to be in 10 or 20 or 30 years if the forecast in terms of what's going to happen in huge parts of the world and climate change are borne out. Because we will see huge migratory flows from all over the world to places which are going to be less affected, which, by the way, includes the UK. So sometimes with this debate around refugees, it's almost as if we seem to think our debate seems to think we can just stick our head in the sand as opposed to and try and avoid all of the global problems which exist. Frankly, we just cannot.
Just before we go to the news, quick one for you, Keith. Brandon says, can you name one public service which has improved over the last 12 years?
Well, I would say actually across the country we are doing a lot better on policing, actually. I think that's improving. We're now investing in 20,000 new police officers.
To replace the 20,000 that were cut.
You're splitting hairs.
No, I'm not splitting hairs. I'm giving you the facts.
Neither of us got any either.
There was a report in the Daily Express today that 9 British police officers every day are looking for jobs in Australia. I don't think the police think you're doing a terribly good job, if that's anything to go by.
1 in 4 paramedics want to leave the service as well over the course of the next year.
Can you top that one, Caroline?
Well, so most of our police services are in special measures, quite frankly, up and down the country. And the recent scandals in the Met Police.
To say most.
Well, no. There's a handful that are in special measures.
That's not most. I mean, you wouldn't want to exaggerate.
A lot. Okay, I'm exaggerating, but there are huge issues in our police service up and down the country. Exactly.
Right, let's move on. We're going to come to more of your questions in a moment. 0345 6060 973. Let's get the latest news headlines on LBC from Charlotte Morgan. It's 8:33.
The Prime Minister says he wants to be judged on his 5 priorities for 2023, which include cutting NHS waiting lists. Rishi Sunak says the government is trying to speed up discharging people from hospital to ease the pressure on urgent care. The Chancellor has announced the government will scale back subsidies for firms' soaring energy costs beyond March. Jeremy Hunt has told business leaders it's unsustainably expensive, and ministers claim the help was only supposed to be there for 6 months. And Crystal Palace chairman Steve Parish has said David Gold was a gentleman who knew how to win with grace and lose with dignity. The West Ham co-chairman has died at the age of 86. LBC weather mainly dry with the odd shower in the north, an overnight low of -1.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
8:36 is the time on LBC. You're listening to Wednesday's Cross Question, or watching, hopefully, on Global Player. Caroline Pidgeon is with us, leader of the Liberal Democrats in the London Assembly. She's the one that can count. Suzanne Evans. I'm not saying you can't count, Suzanne, but grade B at O-level indicates that you might not do. Former Deputy Chairman of UKIP. What are you up to now? Because you were ubiquitous on the radio and TV during all of the Brexit years. Do you miss all of that?
Not really. I've faded into insecurity now, but no, I don't miss it really. It was great to do it, but it was a lot of pressure. I'm director of a public affairs consultancy now, and I'm converting a Grade 2 listed barn in Shropshire, which is keeping me extremely busy and taking every little bit of last cash I've got.
I'm sure it does.
So yeah, that's keeping me going at the moment.
And Lewis Goodall is here, co-presenter of the Newsagents. Now, this podcast is doing terrifically well, isn't it? I'm not just saying that because it's a global podcast.
So it must be all right.
It's fabulous. Morning. It's absolutely fabulous, yes.
Why is it fabulous?
Because there's a great dynamic. They go into detail on an issue that you can't on a show like this. You've got to cover lots of issues, and they get different people on. I say it's different to this, and it's a very enjoyable half hour on my commute to City Hall, because I now have a long commute to City Hall in East
There's another
London.
podcast called For the Many, which you might like to dabble into.
We are just in your shadow.
I will try that now. There you go. It's a new one.
And Keith Prince is here, Conservative member of the London Assembly. We had Sean Barry and Emma Best on last night, and they seemed to be quite friendly, and they said they actually work together quite well. Is it different in the London Assembly? Is it much more collegiate than Parliament?
It does tend to be, but Caroline and I are very good friends, aren't we, Caroline?
We are.
Caroline was a fantastic chair of transport, and I was her deputy.
Enough. Let's go to another question. Right, it's a text question from Andrew in Sheffield. It looks like Rishi Sunak doesn't give a fig, yes, that's fig, about parents. He's binned Liz Truss's plans to make childcare more affordable. Why? Lewis?
Well, I think this goes back to a little bit around what we saw with Channel 4 today. I'm not just mentioning because it was my story. We've already discussed it.
But it was his skills.
Look, I think that this is a certain element of number 10, seeing controversial issues coming down the line and trying to just remove them before we get to the general election, which of course is now next year. The Channel 4 issue was going to be controversial because they probably didn't have the votes in Parliament. The childcare issue is going to be controversial because the Liz Truss plan involved changing the ratios over which how many childcare providers you could have per child, and that was going to be controversial. I think, though, on the childcare point, it is a shame. It's a shame that we're not thinking about how we're going to reform this sector because it is completely broken. In many ways, it is a lot like social care. It has a lot of the hallmarks of social care. Lots and lots of providers, many of which simply can't provide the demand and certainly not the cost which is affordable. And it's not just an issue around fairness and equity, particularly for women who very, very often end up shouldering unfairly a lot of the burden on this, but it's also an economic one. We have a huge productivity problem in this country, a productivity crisis and a growth crisis. One of the inhibitors on that is around childcare. Any person who runs a business right now knows that their business becomes less efficient, has less output, often because the individuals or the parents who work for them are often juggling work and childcare. Norway, which is a country which has basically a universal, very inexpensive childcare system, actually found the Norwegian government found recently, commissioned a survey which showed that the free universal access that they have to childcare has been equivalent in the extra output Norway has enjoyed to its oil reserves. Now, that is absolutely extraordinary because you get more women in the workforce, you get more parents and more businesses able to run their businesses more efficiently. So this is actually potentially a policy, well, it would be a policy, which many economists would say would pay for itself. It's definitely an area of policy and an area around government service which we need more debate on.
Maybe he's just discovered there the Lib Dem policy for the next election.
Well, when I ran for Mayor of London back in 2016, one of the glory days, but one of the things I ran on specifically was around the cost of childcare in London, which is greater than elsewhere. And there's a huge brain drain, particularly of women. 10% fewer women return to work in London than in other regions because the cost of childcare is just so prohibitive.
£500 a week.
You're working hours. You're working just to pay for the childcare. Nothing left over at the end.
How can it be that expensive? I mean, if you think about it, if you say you have 30 kids and they're being charged £100 a day, that's £3,000 a day, so £15,000 a week. How can it possibly cost that amount?
Well, Liz Truss would say it was partly about the ratios. So that's why she wanted to tinker with it.
I would argue also it's partly because it is so heavily subsidised by government. I think when you start to put government subsidies into anything, people think, oh, well, Mrs. Jones and Mr. Jones are getting X amount from the government, therefore we can put our prices up.
It's only subsidised for the government, but for the government for people but it's only subsidised for people with a certain income. Yeah. It's not subsidised for most people.
You get a certain number of free hours.
I think everybody gets
when the child gets to be over 2. But if you talk to any provider of childcare, nurseries, you talk to them, they are struggling to make ends meet with all the overheads they have. Actually, when you talk to them, and I know some very well, they can just about make ends meet. You've got staff who most of them are on the minimum wage. It's very hard to keep staff, retain them. If you've got sick leave and so on, there's lots to cover. It's not
huge number of vacancies.
It's not an industry where you make a huge amount of money. And actually, what you need to be doing is investing in that workforce.
You're getting £500 a week per child, and you're paying minimum wage. There's something wrong there somewhere.
Well, I can assure you, I don't know the absolute detail on it, but when you talk to people who run nurseries, I mean that they aren't making huge money at all.
I have to say, I know some people that run nurseries, and they're making an extraordinary.
Well, there you go. But I have to say, having had a child go through nursery, and it is crippling. It is absolutely crippling. And if you have several children, you really are just juggling, trying to work out whether you can afford to work, or juggling several jobs, and it's a huge pressure. The idea that Liz Truss's plan, she didn't really have a plan. It was just an embryonic idea that she would like to do something about staff ratios. That was kind of as far as the detail, as much as I could see. So I think it's not that they've broken that; they just have decided not to pursue this little idea that Liz had at some point.
Keith.
Well, I mean, the government do give 15 free hours for the over 2s. I think there's certain circumstances they can double that. But funnily enough, somebody I know very well was actually trying to place a few children in. She works for a refuge and trying to place a few children into nurseries, and the nurseries were saying, oh well, yes, we can give you the 15 free hours, but you have to pay extra on top. And they said, oh well, we feed them, we do this, and they want maybe as much as £11 extra per day, and for the women in the refuge, they can't afford that, so something needs to be done clearly.
Yeah,
you busy, Ian?
I was just my phone's on silent and it suddenly sprung to life. So apologies for that.
Happened to me.
Thanks for pointing that out.
That's all right. Anytime, anything for a fellow LBC presenter.
Okay, well let's come to you on this. What would your solution be to this then, Lewis?
I would need massive. Well, the government should fund a universal service as other European countries do. Norway does it. Sweden. In Norway, you pay £200 a month maximum per child. And as I say, it is a policy that over the long term will pay for itself because it makes the economy more efficient, more productive. At the moment,
there are lots of votes in this, aren't there?
100%. I do not understand right now. I think this is a huge gaping space at the centre of British politics. There's just waiting for a political party to come along and occupy.
There you are, Caroline.
There you go. Well, I'm sure my party will be listening to this. But no, actually, we do need to invest in early years. And it's so critical. We talked about maths earlier. Actually, if you don't get the numeracy and literacy right from that early 100%, stage, 100%. Children slip back. And you see that in other European countries that they really have.
Right, we've got lots of questions stacking up here, some really good ones. So we'll come to those in just a moment. You're listening to LBC. It's 8:45.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
You can't send Christmas cards. You can't go to work. Grandma's going to be dumped at a hospital on a trolley as the ambulance takes off. Oh, and we've got the migrant crisis with a record number, a world record number. And Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, will emerge today to say that maths is at the heart of his vision for Britain. Well, it might help if those dolts Liz Truss and Kwesi Kwarteng knew a bit more about maths in the September, October of last year and landed us in the crisis.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player, LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Caroline Pidgeon, Suzanne Evans, Lewis Goodall and Keith Prince with us answering your questions. Let's go to Matt in Edinburgh. Hello, Matt.
Yeah, look, just going back to the thing about arithmetic and spelling.
Do we have to?
You know what I mean? I mean, it's a very important. I mean, the Scots seem to have got that basically right with John Knox. It was like, you had to sort of be able to read the Bible. Yeah, that was kind of what was going on.
I'll take your word for that. What's your question, Matt?
Numbers in the Bible.
Well, I don't know how many numbers are in the Bible. Lots of pages.
What's your question, Matt?
I don't really have a question. I'm just making a statement.
Well, what's the point in phoning in then?
Well, I'm obviously
Think of
lots
one, Matt.
Joy. You know what I mean?
Well, do you have a question or not? Because if not, I'll move on to somebody else.
All right. Well, okay. Why is England full of English public school people?
What?
What?
Why is England full of public school people?
Scots have public schools as well, of course.
Yeah, I mean, have you heard of Fettes School?
Oh, yeah.
Gordonston.
I mean, it's not just England.
no,
what have you got against the English, Matt?
Well, no, that's Nicky Campbell and all that, isn't it? He's on another different radio station.
I think we'll just move on, shall we? There's always one, and Matt is it. Jonathan is in Moortham Forest. Hello, Jonathan. Have you got a sensible question for us?
Yes, I do, I hope. I'm just wondering what would it take for Parliament to remove any remaining titles from those two in America? All titles.
What, Joe Biden, you mean?
Him as well.
Biden and Trump.
You mean Prince Harry and, is he still called Prince? The Duke of Sussex and the Duchess of Sussex. Let's give them their royal titles. Keith Prince.
Well, I believe that titles are conferred on them by the King. So I don't think Parliament needs to get involved. I think this is in the behest of the King. To be fair, I think King Charles is trying very, very hard to smooth things over. I think that Harry is on some kind of suicide mission. I really do not understand why he's behaving the way that he is. I just don't get it at all.
Well, they clearly feel that they've been wronged and they want a public admission from Charles or William that wrong has been done, and that's the only way that there's ever going to be a reconciliation.
But surely, if you're dealing with your family, you do it behind closed doors, don't you? If he thinks someone's been wronged, or if you think someone's been rude to his wife, then you go. If it's Charles or his brother, you go up and say, look, that's bang out of order. And things can be smoothed over much better. Doing your dirty washing in public never works, and it makes it very difficult. Very difficult for how can the King publicly discuss his family? It just doesn't work. And I just think Harry just has lost the plot, frankly.
Caroline?
Yeah, I mean, the royal family are not the Kardashians, quite frankly. And, Harry might be over there with Meghan and making money out of this. Do it behind closed doors. Every family has fallings out and, they make up at some point. He ought to be doing that. But also the media are so obsessed by them and so obsessed over Meghan and her race and what that means, what it doesn't mean. Let's compare her to Kate. Why don't we just let them get on with whatever they want to do with their lives? Kate and William can do their good work they're doing, the King can do his, and Harry and Meghan can make their new life in America. Let's stop being so obsessed by it. Far more important things in the world.
Sorry, just come back. I mean, the really disappointing thing is that Harry, before he met Meghan, and I'm not making any allegations, but he was doing some really good stuff like the Invictus Games, and he was actually making a really good contribution.
And around mental health.
Yeah, and lots of stuff. And I just feel it's such a shame that he's just lost the plot.
Suzanne?
It is a great shame. I really feel for the royal family, actually, and for Harry and Meghan, who obviously feel they've been wronged, and they make their own argument for that. But I think, well, first of all, to answer Jonathan's question, it's not in Parliament's gift to be able to remove their royal titles.
Well, they could pass an act of Parliament.
Gosh. Well, if you really wanted to make Harry and Meghan feel like victims, that would the way and prove them right. I think that would be the way to go, wouldn't it? But
I don't think they need to be made to feel like that.
Well, they do already, but for them to prove it to perhaps the rest of the world. But King Charles is caught between the devil and the deep blue sea here. But I think even if he did decide to remove their titles, and I don't think he will, I'm no expert in royal protocol, but when would they then just not become Prince Harry and Princess Meghan? I think they would still have some titles, and perhaps she'd prefer to be a princess than a duchess. Who knows?
That's why she married him.
Lewis.
I don't care really, and I'm far more interested in whether Kevin McCarthy becomes House Speaker than rather than... look, I mean, I suppose the only thing I'd say is that, look, I think that it is... the thing that I find fascinating about the Harry and Meghan thing is the extent to which everyone wants to make them angels or demons. You know, they've become a sort of element of the culture war. To some extent, they've made themselves that. But, you know, they get, you know, you're either sort of William and... if you're a paper, you're either a William and Kate person or you're a Harry and Meghan person. It seems to me that it's entirely possible that sometimes they can be quite annoying. And I've watched the Harry and Meghan documentary, and sometimes they can be a little annoying. But sometimes also, it's perfectly possible they could have some quite reasonable points.
I think so. I've watched all six, and I agree.
I think you could make an argument that it is a bit disappointing that as an institution, the royal family wasn't able to find a way, given the renewal that she did represent in so many ways, and that real moment of change, that they weren't able to find a way to make this work. And I'm sure there was fault on probably every side in that.
Well, I did spend 6 hours of my 17 days off watching the Netflix documentary, feeling slightly dirty for having done so. But I'll be completely honest and say that I slightly warmed to them, or felt sort of... I understood them, I think, a little bit better at the end of it. And although there were lots of things they said in that I didn't agree with, I probably understood better where they were coming
from. There's no
from.
doubt she's been treated appallingly by...
I mean, the press intrusion...
There's no doubt. It's appalling.
Nobody can deal with that. No. However tough and emotionally resilient you are, that is impossible to deal with. And I have every sympathy for them on that. But, you know, I'm sorry, trying to make out that we're all a racist country, no, so wrong.
But there have been racist tropes deployed against her at times by certain elements of the press. I think there's a reason. I'm not saying that she is without... I mean, I don't care really about her in so many ways, but I think there's no doubt that in so many ways, Markle, Duchess of Sussex, you know, she ticked 3 of the big boxes, right, that sometimes can really put you in a bad place with elements of the British media. You know, she's a woman, she's a mixed-race woman, and she's a working-class woman. And some of the stuff like Straight Outta Compton and all that, I mean, it was outrageous. I mean, particularly when you compare the way that she'd been treated with...
It was one comment in one newspaper.
I know,
I think on the whole, she was very much welcomed into the royal family and by the British public.
I think both things can be true, right? There were elements where she was welcomed, and then there were elements that were always going to be... There was a turn, and, you know, events have gone in the way they have. And I think that as that documentary actually did show, again, they could be a bit annoying in the way they present themselves sometimes, but it was quite compelling in some of the way that they presented the evidence in terms of how they were treated by the media. That's a separate question in terms of what the king should do, of course.
Right, final text question from Claire in Luton. Was the government's threat to privatise Channel 4 designed to stop it speaking truth to power? Suzanne?
I don't think Channel 4 would be my choice of speaking truth to power or to anyone where else, to be honest. I think we live in a multimedia age where I think actually public funding of broadcasters, it's probably time to bring that to an end.
It's not public.
Including the BBC?
Including the BBC, yeah. I used to be a strong defender of the licence fee, but I really just think in this changing multimedia landscape that we have now, I'm not really convinced it's justifiable anymore.
It would be like the Ravens leaving the tower for the BBC not to at least be in part publicly funded,
hopefully nobody would die as a consequence of that, which I think is what's supposed to happen, isn't it, if the Ravens leave the tower? But no, I think... I think... I also have changing feelings about the BBC, I'll be honest. I think it used to be a really powerful public service broadcaster. I'm not sure it does anymore accurately reflect the opinions of modern Britain.
Lewis, well, you spent some years working at the BBC. I mean, obviously the question's about Channel 4, but if you put the two together...
Well, I think they're slightly separate in the sense that, there's always going to be questions about the licence fee, in the sense that, you know, it was something that was designed a century ago. And, you know, I think anyone, I think even advocates of the BBC would say, you know, it's absolutely legitimate that every 10 years is checked and renewed and considered. Channel 4 is slightly different in the sense that it's not publicly funded, it's publicly owned, but it's not publicly funded, it pays for itself. So there was always a question mark about the extent to which, you know, why the government said it needed to raise capital and needed to be put into potentially the hands of a private buyer when, you know, it is, at the moment anyway, self-sustaining. These were quite separate questions. But look, I mean, I think that clearly there have been huge changes in the media market. They're going to continue to be so. And the BBC is going to be the big one. But I think that what's interesting politically is it's clear that Sunak, as we've already discussed, wanted to retreat from this potential problem coming down the tracks. Didn't talk, you know, we don't know what their policy is going to be on the BBC, but it seems unlikely that they're going to have such a pugnacious attitude as the Johnson government did.
30 seconds each, Keith.
Well, I think the BBC is too big. I think it's...
Questions about Channel 4.
Well, Channel 4... I think Sunak's got more important things to worry about right now, frankly.
I thought it was a rash and sort of desperate sort of scrabbling round for an idea for a government that's well and truly out of ideas. And I'm glad that it's, there's been a U-turn on this. And but you can't afford for different government ministers to come in with their latest crazy idea and for public money to be spent on that. We need to get the basics right in getting our public services
one-word answer
delivered.
for this final text question from Jonathan in Norwich. Maths is naff. Everybody knows it. What was your panel's favourite subject at school? Keith?
Maths.
Caroline?
Geography.
Suzanne?
Religious studies.
Really?
And I did it for my degree. I find it fascinating why people become religious, why they stay religious, how it works, the sociology, philosophy of it.
Yes.
Exciting.
History. History in German, I would say. Thank you very much indeed to my panel. We'll have another one up for you tomorrow tomorrow's Thursday. We don't have a panel on Thursdays, do we? But we will do next Monday. Coming up in a moment, we're going to return to the subject of maths. Should everyone learn maths up to the age of 18? That's a question I want to put to you. It is the case in many European countries that people do study maths until 18, but I wonder whether it would be right here. That's what Rishi Sunak is saying today in his so-called landmark speech, which we talked about in the 7 o'clock hour. What would the advantages be? I have to say that it would have given me absolutely no advantage to spend an extra 2 years studying maths, but maybe you disagree. Love to hear from maths teachers as well. 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, Rishi Sunak's promising to cut waiting lists in one of 5 visions for his premiership. He says he wants a health service where patients are in control with as much choice as possible. The Prime Minister